rolling for stats is fun for like 30 seconds and then everything breaks. All right, obviously I'm exaggerating. Nothing really breaks. You can roll for stats and still make for a good game. It's not going to be like the difference between an awesome game and a terrible game or anything like that. But I do have a few points about rolling for stats that I'd like to share. Now, as always, your game and your table are your responsibility, so you should do whatever you think will create the best possible experience. But I'd like to explain a few of the considerations that you should have about rolling for stats that you may not have thought of before. So the first problem I think it has is class options. If a player goes into a game thinking they want to play a certain class, but then the stats they roll just don't allow for it, you end up with a pretty major issue because they had that expectation to begin with. Then transitioning out of wanting to play that class and into playing something else can be a huge problem. Third is the power discrepancy it can cause between players. If one player rolls much lower than all the other players, that player can very easily start to get left behind in terms of usefulness in combat and things like that. And that's always very frustrating. And I know there are ways around that, but the thing is, if you're going to go through all of this trouble to make it so that rolling for stats results in pretty even distributions of stats for all your players, just use point by your standard array. That already fixes that. That problem never occurs with those systems. And finally, I want to talk about one that you might not have heard of before. There's this problem with creating tension in decision making as player progression continues. With particularly high stats and particularly low stats, players are less likely to choose something other than ability score improvement at 4th, 8th, etc., or 6th if you're a fighter, whatever. When it comes time to take your ability score improvement, if you've rolled particularly high or particularly low stats, you're much more likely to be pushed toward actually taking the improvement of your attributes over a feat. Think about it like this. If you're at 18 of your main stat and you hit 4th level, you're probably just gonna top that off. It's your main stat, it helps a lot, and you're finishing it off. You might as well. And it creates a sense of completion. It actually feels really good to look at your character sheet and see a 20 in your main stat. Like, that feels really good. And that feedback that you get really drives you to go from 18 to 20 a lot more than it drives you to go from 16 to 18. And on the other side, if you have a really low stat, you better believe that you're going to get that up there as quickly as possible. If you're at a 14 or a 15 in your primary stat, which can happen, it's unlikely, I know, but it can happen, you're going to rush to get at least one ability score improvement. And if you do decide to go for a feat, pretty much guaranteed it's only because you have a 15 and not a 14 in that stat, and you're going to take one that gives you one to that attribute. But why is that a problem? Well, tension is really your core building block as a game designer, and by removing the tension between ability score improvement and feats, or at least shifting the attractiveness of ability score improvement away from feats, means that as the character progresses, there are fewer opportunities to express that character in unique and interesting ways in a way that makes a player feel a sense of ownership over that character. Also, if a player is making a character decision about their build, either during creation initially or during the progression stages, it's really important that they have two decisions to go off of, because if they have only one, then what you end up with is a situation where the player just thinks, well, I'm going to do that and not take a feat. But there's no real idea of what specifically they might do otherwise. And the idea of having a specific thing that they decided not to take, like for example, if they said, I don't want Great Weapon Master because I would rather have extra stats, or vice versa, that creates much more interesting feedback later, because now every time they use that feat or hit something with their stats, they're going to feel good about using that feat or good about taking those stats. But also you might find that they actively miss the other thing that they didn't take, and that's really important too, because what you did decide to do is just as important as what you didn't decide to do when it comes to defining who you are as a character. Also, if you're rolling for stats, depending on how things work out, you may be inadvertently incentivizing players to do things like make extra characters or roll a lot of arrays, and then you have to deal with all of that. And then if you do finish character creation and you start the game, one player might decide, I hate my stat array and I can't really play a paladin this way, or a monk, or whatever they're doing. and they might think, I would like to retire my character. And now you have this weird situation where, should you let the player retire the character or shouldn't you? Because they went through the character creation process and you've started the game, but it's only like maybe session 2 or 3. Is it really a good idea to let them just throw that character out and start a new one? Because that sets a strange precedent where every time you get stats that you don't like, you just make a new character. But if you don't let them, now they're stuck with those terrible stats, where obviously if you use point buy or standard array, that problem never occurs. Also, especially with point buy, but also to some extent with standard array, when you're deciding where to allocate your stats, a lot of really interesting player decisions go into that character creation process. How much do you want to dump one stat versus not dump that stat? Do I want a higher intelligence because I don't want my character to feel stupid? Or do I want my character to be weak? These kinds of interesting decisions happen only because of point buy and the way that it works, and they're just as valid as rolling dice and seeing what happens in terms of discovering your character, because you're still asking interesting, meaningful questions about your character, and as you answer them, you discover your character. And yes, you can absolutely work around these by adding rules, but why compound rule after rule after rule just to get rolled stats to work basically just as well as point buy? Now you might say, I like rolling for stats because my players have higher stats, and that's really cool. It makes them feel powerful. To which I would say 2 things. 1, being more powerful and feeling more powerful are not the same thing. You can make your players feel more powerful without actually increasing their quantifiable power. Second, if you do just want them to have higher stats, you can use a tool like chickendinner.com and modify the parameters of point buy, which allows you to go higher or lower or have more points to spend. So something like that means that you can have higher stats, but also it's totally equitable. Everybody has the same tools to start with, and then they customize to their heart's desire. Some people like to roll down the line where they take strength and they roll 46, drop lowest, and that's their strength score. And then they do the same for dex, constitution, and all the way down. And if you're going to roll for stats, I think this is probably the way to do it, because randomness now actually serves a purpose within that character creation process. But I would say it's really important to understand why you're doing that and what player experience you're creating. And not just in the short term. Because remember, the decisions that you make now affect, yes, the short-term player experience, but it also affects the player experience down the line, just like how character progression can be affected by the method of determining stats that you use. And also, if it comes down to, well, it's all about exploring and discovering the character, again, that isn't excluded by using point buy or standard array. Point buy is definitely better than standard array because of the questions that it raises, but it's similar. But really both of them work. I just think point buy works a lot better than standard array does in that regard. Rolling for stats really offers this momentary excitement, and it is excitement. It's big excitement. It's great excitement. But then it either lifts you up or it lets you down. Rolling for stats is basically like, if you rolled well, great. If you didn't, oh well. And now we're gonna move on with that anyway. Or you layer a ton of rules on, and the result of layering rule after rule after rule is this incredibly complex method for generating stats. And it turns out that point buy just already does all that. So anything that I think is valid as a reason for rolling stats, really point buy can also accomplish. And then you have all these consequences and pitfalls that could be associated with rolling for stats that, when it comes down to it, just isn't worth that couple of minutes of excitement that you get from rolling the dice. So that's all I've got when it comes to rolling for stats. Again, your table, your game, your rules, because it's your responsibility, and you have to do what you think is best. But I hope I've at least given you pause to think a little bit more about what rolling for stats can actually do for you and what the detriments might be. And if I've converted you from rolling to point buy, then so much for the better. Welcome to the club. I don't know what the next video is going to be. Maybe more homebrew. Okay, bye.